He doesn't understand that he's the one who has the power to stop it. He simply can't imagine that one little boy could be that important.
Is it really me? Maybe he doesn't know what he has to do! What do I have to do?
He has to give me a new name. He's already chosen it. He just has to call it out.
But it's only a story. It's not real.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to Furry Dashi Pod. I'm your host, Lauren Ash, here with Nicholas.
Hey everybody! I don't know why I became a carnival barker there for a second. Like, hey everybody, come down, see the spectacle.
Exactly, see the spectacle. What will we tell? What will we show? Furry Dashi Pod, here to tell you what
We're not
actually
showing
goes in.
anything.
No, we're not showing anything. Well, we will eventually actually thank you. So thank you all for listening and supporting us for these many years, of which there have been 2.
Yeah.
And I wanted to, of which there have
These
been
many
2
2 years.
These many 2 years. I actually did want to mention that we will be putting more of our snippets onto YouTube as well for the episodes and also for Patreon. So please go ahead and subscribe to our YouTube channel if you haven't already, and already get a lot of content that Nicholas has gone from our streaming days to past games that we've played and other Let's Plays. So please look forward to that. Now on to today's episode. I have been super excited to be talking about something that I love, which is narrative, and mainly how that narrative is delivered into the game. But as Nicholas and I were chatting about what we wanted to talk about, we realized that we have talked a lot about systems. We've talked a lot about narrative delivery, where narrative gets played in the game, when it's given to the user, how it gets told to the user. But we really haven't talked about what is narrative?
What is a story, Lauren?
What is a story? What is a narrative? What are these things? If you were here with us on our Patreon episode, you remember that I shamelessly took this from an amazing person named Kat Manning, who described the story as what the player hears and sees in the game, and narrative is what or how that story is delivered in the game. She had said that way better than me, and I know that I quoted myself way better on Patreon. So if you aren't a Patreon subscriber, please go subscribe right now and listen to our previous episode. But for today,
if you want articulate Lauren, you have to pay. We're very sorry.
We're so sorry. I'm not sorry. I absolutely love the thing about our podcast is that we're always exactly ourselves, and they're very quirky. Yeah. And our energy levels, like humans, definitely frequent during some episodes where we're higher energy and more articulate, and other episodes where we're not. But just like any good voice actor, the mood has to match the subject matter. And so tying this right back on today's episode, I really want to talk about what exactly story is, or rather maybe what it's, and sometimes what it's not. And what actually would you consider narrative in a game?
Yeah.
Which the easiest answer is, it depends.
the answer is it's something. Well, okay,
it's there.
It's worth reminding our listeners that in the past we actually have defined narrative pretty broadly, because there are a lot of aspects of games that we haven't. I mean, Lauren and I kind of disagree about this, but I have been willing to concede that there are aspects of gameplay that can actually be discussed in narrative terms. And so we generally tend to take a fairly broad perspective.
Right. And we take a broad perspective, right, because we do actually disagree on this issue.
Yep.
And I think that, like many good game developers out there, I disagree with a lot of people. And I'm fueled by spite and vindication. I'm kidding.
No.
I've been told I'm very nice to work with. Yay, go me. But I will say that it's kind of funny because that's the narrative that I've told myself, is that I have been fueled by spite, or
Yeah.
that a lot of people disagree with me. The issue is not so much that people disagree; it's that my general definition, or my generifish, is what I was about to say.
Yeah.
Is that narrative is a construct of the video game itself. It is
Yeah.
both something that the player experiences or is shown, right? Such like a cinematic, but it's also something that they do, right?
Yeah.
Like an interactive cutscene, a QuickTime event. It also could be something as running through, right? It's the typical run out moment of a Tomb Raider game, Uncharted, right? Guardians of the Galaxy. It's the Lara Croft run through, right? Floors falling, all these scripted events are happening. And that's a very cinematic moment. But it's not necessarily a cutscene, right? Like it's not
Yeah.
being told to you. But what is happening, right, are a lot of story elements, right? Someone's yelling, Lara, you've got to get out of the temple. It's like, you shouldn't have stolen it. Oh, but I'm a treasure hunter and I steal things. And then, you know, she's holding the thing. She almost drops it. You're running, you're picking it up. You have to press triangle really quickly. Oh no, now you have to press, you know, circle because you have to dodge out of the way. I
Stupid
mean,
QuickTime events.
stupid QuickTime events, and or just Detroit Become Human.
Yeah.
Which is
Sick
one.
burn, Lauren. Sick burn.
That's the first game I actually ever platinumed, to be honest.
I know you like
because
that. I know you like
I
that.
actually quite like that game, but creator aside, completely condone that. And Lauren's like, excuse me, but it is interesting, right? Because would you say that the narrative or the story of Detroit Become Human, right, is good? Would you say that the gameplay is good, right? Like that's kind of what, when we look at a QuickTime event or we look at a cinematic, what you see and hear in the game, right? It could be who the character is. What the game presents to you is both narrative, quote unquote, right? But is story, right? It's it's all of the elements of that. So this is kind of, for me at least, picking apart what those elements are, right? And for me, teasing out where narrative happens and where narrative doesn't happen but is still considered story.
Well, yeah, because it's really easy to look at, say, like a visual novel and figure out what the what of the story is, because it's literally, it's right there. It's on screen. it is literally displaying itself as you read it.
Now,
but
really
then
quickly.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, really quickly, not to interrupt you, and I do apologize for that, but I want to make sure that our listeners out there who, like me, are English majors and also majored in creative writing and are probably going, Lauren, story has a very concrete definition in writing. There are all these different elements of story, how to craft the best story, how to craft it for a screenwrite or for a script versus how you would craft it in prose, a fiction novel, nonfiction. Listen, peoples, I hear you. I am one of you. For the purposes of this, we're literally identifying what is story in the confines of the medium of video game development.
Yeah.
So when I say story, I am not talking about plot, like only plot, right? And I'm not just talking about characters or events or acts. Okay, I am talking about literally what you see and hear, read, but not experience necessarily within that game world.
Well, I mean,
Nicholas, you're going to have to help me out here, because since we disagree a lot, and our terms and definitions when it comes to story and narrative, especially for listeners who have their own, are going to be just kind of varied, right?
Okay, so yeah, I mean, something that I brought up in the Patreon episode that I want to bring up again because it is relevant is that in narratology, which is the literary study of narrative, it is a thing. There is this classic distinction between, unfortunately, the terms are French. I apologize. Histoire and récit. So histoire is the French word for story. So that's kind of the same. Récit is much more complicated. It's related to the word like recitation in English, but it also has a very specific meaning in French. It refers to a kind of novel that sort of draws attention to its novelness, so to speak. So then this term récit comes to refer to sort of like how the story presents itself. And so this is what Lauren was previously defining as narrative, is the how of, you know, the story rather than sort of like the content of the story. But the reason why this becomes complicated when you're talking about video games is because, like I said, it's really easy to sort of determine what the story of a visual novel is. But it's like, what is the story of the opening sequence of Halo? And I actually thought a little bit about this recently because I've been taking notes about Halo, of all things. Because the thing
Oh, what you
is,
study in game dev academia.
because there's the aspect of it that is the dialogue, when Master Chief is thought out, and the scientists who are there are like, oh, Master Chief, we got to check you out, and then you do the dumb tutorial bits where you have to like move the camera around and so forth. But that's not the interesting part. The interesting part is the part where you actually have to get from that sort of like test chamber to the bridge of the, oh, I can't remember what the name of the ship is. Like something of Autumn, the Autumn Dawn, whatever the ship is called. I don't remember.
I'm
Anyway,
the
so
last person to know.
you have to get to the bridge because the captain is going to hand Cortana over to you, and you have to protect Cortana, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that sequence from like the movement from the chamber where you're thawed out to the bridge, there is actually very little dialogue, and yet it has a fairly clear story. And the story is, I mean, it's sort of like, an escape or like heist based thing, but the way in which it progresses you through a series of chambers almost to me feels kind of like the way in which, say, in animation you lay out storyboards. Like I could imagine storyboarding that, but I couldn't necessarily imagine writing that. And so for video games, oftentimes, especially since you're talking about like visual elements, sound elements, and all sorts of other things, it's almost better to think of story in terms of storyboarding rather than in terms of, say, like plotting or a script, I think, personally.
I tend to agree with that, because I think whenever you're looking for video games as like a translation from screenwriting, a lot of times when you're in narrative design, they're asking for a script, right?
Yeah.
Of like a cinematic, or how would you write this? And a lot of times my answer to that is I wouldn't.
Yeah.
Not because the writing would be bad, but because if I wrote it, it would be more prosy, right? And if I tried to give prose to a storyboard artist, they'd ask me what's happening. And it'd be like, well, did you read the doc? And they're like, yeah, I read it, but I don't get what's happening. Because at the end of the day, you are making a visual experience that the player is going to, like you said, be walking through.
Yeah.
So I think that, well, walking or running or fighting, like whatever
just
verb, they're going to
doing shit
verb
in. Like
through. They're
there
going
is
to
a
be
volume in which they are in. They're doing
there is
stuff.
there is a volume in which they are in, and the volume will change, right, depending on the story that
Yeah.
you're trying to tell. And I think that's where I start to get frustrated, is that in Halo, right, the story is what is happening through that moment, right?
Yeah.
You're experiencing, say, the narrative of Halo is not the story, right? Like the narrative of Halo was very different.
Yeah.
But I can actually do this in a few sentences, and really only with this game that I hope our listeners have either semi understood or know of, which is Half-Life 2. And that the half story of Half-Life 2 is actually really good.
I have never heard of it.
No.
Whatever this game is. This random indie game that you have chosen.
Half-Life 2's story, everybody understands. But I think what's interesting is that if I was to go to a game developer and be like, how is the narrative in Half-Life 2? They would say there is none. Not that there isn't story. They would say that, well, there is no narrative wrapper to Half-Life 2. Everything that happens in the game. There's no narrative. And what they mean is there's no journal, there's no logbook, there's no sticker book for collect all the characters and get to read about them in the codex, like in Mass Effect, right? There's no relationships, there's no reputation meter, there's no real cut between gameplay cinematic and super big cine, because there's no big cine budget, right? So they're going, well, there's no cinematic, there's no QTEs that there technically are, but they're cleverly hidden because there's no button prompts right on the screen. There's no UI. So they're like, there's no narrative. Oh, but I loved the story. And I think that for me is what I hope helps you understand and articulate that divide, right, between Histoire and Récit.
Récit, yeah. RECIT.
Histoire and Récit. And trying. And I don't speak French. And I think that the story, right, what you're doing, maybe not even so much why you're doing it, but what you're doing in that moment, right? Whether or not there is dialogue, that's all just a part of the story, those elements, that storyboarding, right? That sequence of events that kind of gets you through. And narrative can help tell that story. Narrative can also hurt that story.
Okay, give me an example of that. Give me an example of a situation in which, even if it's a hypothetical one, where like the narrative could actually like get in the way of the storytelling process.
Well, I think the biggest way narrative gets in the way of the storytelling process, and this is why systems designers love me and sometimes cinematic people hate me, is that I think cutscenes largely get in the way of story sometimes. Because whenever you have a narrative moment between two characters and you just save someone's life on the battlefield from dying, and then it cuts to them lurching over in pain in a cutscene, emotionally groveling on the floor, and you went, dude, you were at full health. And I saved your butt, and I just gave you 2 potions, and you literally just used up all my reserves. I have no more skill points, and you're lying on the floor dying. We just went through this. Now the game is showing you something different, right?
Yeah.
And that's the narrative that's now hurting the story of you overcoming this boss, right?
Yeah.
Now that's not the same as, say, a narrative gimmick that happens frequently in single player games where nothing we're doing works. His health just won't go down. Whatever will we do?
Yeah.
Right? That's also hurting the story of you being an amazing and incredible team of heroes trying to defeat a villain when you're just mashing your buttons in a game, right? That's the netzi, because that's the I like, does that make sense?
I think the problem that you're identifying there is really boils down to the fact that it's a gimmick. It's that instead of, because you could think of a way in which you could structure a boss encounter where you still feel like you're making progress against the boss, but it's going to lead into certain, like, they don't necessarily have to be cutscenes, but they could be sort of like breaks in the encounter.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that's actually a bad thing. Yeah, I think for me, like, the reason,
I actually do think it is. I actually do think it is kind of a bad thing if it's done poorly. You have to be very deft.
Yeah,
with,
it has
how you handle it.
No, the reason the issue is that when you ask me to say how does narrative harm, right, a story, is that narrative can also, whenever narrative helps the story, you almost don't even recognize that it's helping, because when maybe you are getting the codex entry in No Man's Sky about something.
Yeah.
And as you start exploring more and more planets and you realize that all of these different things that you've discovered can now be used to create something else.
Yeah.
You're recognizing that the story of you being a lone adventurer in the world, I guess, like, going into and create, like, because it's proc gen narrative, I guess, like, so I'm kind of getting like caught up in my own details. But basically the story, I've played No Man's Sky very briefly, and so I did not resonate with the story or with, like, the overall, like, narrative as I was trying to experience it. But basically when you on your first planet, right, you build enough parts for the ship and you go and explore and you find other people's planets and stuff. Like, the narrative or the theme is, like, even in a world completely, like, alone, you are never, like, or even when you are isolated, like, you're never alone or whatever, right? Like, there's, like, this grand narrative, and there's a ton of writing and a ton of history and a ton of lore, right? That's all story.
Yeah.
But the narrative arcs you create for yourself are happening because you are playing the game, right? So I think that in this case with No Man's Sky, the narrative that you're experiencing is something that you aren't even recognizing as helping the stories that you tell for yourself within that world. Versus narrative would harm it if suddenly they started putting in cutscenes, like, randomly if they started spawning NPCs, or every time you saw a player, it became like, and now fight. Like, that would completely destroy the story, right, of No Man's Sky.
Well, no, and it's sort of the way in which, like, random encounters, especially in RPGs, oftentimes get really frustrating because you feel like you're moving along at a particular pace, and then all of a sudden it's like a random pointless fight. Yeah, but I mean, because the thing is, like, if the fight were motivated by some sort of, like, narrative element, or actually, I have a good example of this because I've been recently playing this game. So I recently finished the second chapter of Long Gone Days, which is a very good indie game. If you haven't played it, I highly suggest it. What's really interesting about that game is that it has a turn-based combat system, much like, every other turn-based RPG on the planet. Well, with some important differences that I'm not going to get into. But the meaningful distinction here is that there are no random encounters in that game. Every single combat encounter is narratively driven. And because it's narratively driven, it also means that the combat encounters themselves can really tax like your character's resources in terms of their health, in terms of their, it's called morale, which is basically their action points. And so you feel like there is this seamless integration between the combat and the narrative, precisely because of the fact that it hasn't thrown in, as you were saying, like those random elements that sort of like constantly throw you out of the flow of the game. In other words, there is a more seamless transition. Another game that I think does the cutscene well is a game that Lauren and I have played a ton of, which is Final Fantasy XIV. I think that game actually does a really good job, especially like the pre-combat cutscenes. Like, you know, before you're going into like a really big like encounter in the main story quest, it does a really good job of sort of transitioning from like encountering the boss and then moving into the actual like fight itself, especially with the trials. So it can be done well, but you're right. It's more like if it's being thrown in haphazardly, then, and if it takes you out of whatever sort of like gameplay flow that you happen to be in, that's then when sort of, yeah, the narrative elements are kind of like screwing with
Yeah,
the
and that's
storytelling.
yes, exactly. And that's what I want to talk about for really identifying what the what of story is.
Yeah.
Because I have been playing a lot of Yakuza Like a Dragon.
Yep.
I really haven't played a lot of the Yakuza series in the past because, to be completely honest, a lot of them came out when I was under my parents' control, and I wasn't allowed to play M-rated games. And no, I also wasn't allowed to sneak them, and I was kind of too busy with, I guess, life. So I was just like, you know what, it's not worth it.
Yeah.
To potentially get in trouble when I have World of Warcraft that I'm addicted to. So why bother?
Yeah.
So that's where my money went. And they didn't know that World of Warcraft was probably just as crazy as Yakuza, but not as crazy as Yakuza Like a Dragon.
Yeah.
And it is a fantastic game. And it's something that really made me think differently about narrative delivery and story because of how ridiculous some of the stories are in the game, and also how they're delivered and how you have to go out of your way to kind of get a cohesive story.
Yeah.
And in some ways, you have to use the objective system to kind of find where you need to talk to. A lot of the sub stories are not organically delivered to you, versus a lot of the combat of Yakuza Like a Dragon, which is it's actually turn based, but in the previous titles, Yakuza is actually all combo based. So that was a step departure for them. It has a lot more like environmental effects. It's much more RPG. But the fights can be so difficult and so tough sometimes that you're almost rewarded with the cutscene. And I was trying to figure out a better way of phrasing that other than the word reward. So apologies for the pause there, I guess. But really, it's not, because the narrative isn't really a reward in Yakuza so much as like the relief and the joy after overcoming the battle. And some of the battles that are really tough are really tough. Like you end up having to kind of escape out of them, hopefully have a previous save, like always be saving. And it's like, always be selling, always be saving.
Always be saving.
Always be saving. Hopefully you have that previous save. And if you don't, like, you're totally screwed. Because then you go, you level up, you come back. And then it feels like, oh, this is still really difficult, even though I, like, you know, got all my levels and got all my gear to this place. Now that I've defeated the boss, I am so excited to see, right, that pre-cutscene and that post-cutscene, right? I can skip through the pre-cut scene because I've seen this many times. Yes, you're going to kick my butt. Yes, you totally did. But no, I'm going to actually get you this time. Okay, now I finally got you. Ha, wallow in your pity. And I really enjoyed that off and on kind of banter when normally I would, in some cases, like I would talk about Yakuza and be like, oh, there's just way too many cutscenes. I felt like 10 hours of cutscenes. And then I was like, oh, this really helped set up the emotional resonance of all of the characters that I had to fight later on.
Yeah.
Oh, this really set up a bunch of plot and story that honestly I didn't think that I would ever actually see again. Like I had no idea why you showed me this scene. Oh, this sub story is unlocking game mechanics that I can use in these fights that will make me more powerful, that feeds into the story of Ichiban being super, super powerful. Oh, but that's the narrative, right? Is that now the story of him being powerful and him just like running headfirst in situations is now me just being headfirst running into situations because I know that I can just like break dance my way through this combat encounter because apparently I can be a break dancer because my character, they've told me is that he just does whatever the fuck he wants.
Yeah.
So I can do whatever the fuck, like you see, like it all interweaves now that you're going, Lauren, are you talking about narrative delivery because you're talking about the cutscenes and the sub stories? Are you talking about the
Well,
story
no,
because
you're
it's being
not.
shown to you? Yeah, like there's a
So
lot.
I want to highlight something that you said and sort of like break it down a little bit, because when you were talking about sort of like the difficulty of like certain encounters, and you like some of the fights are really really hard, and you have to come back like so when you're thinking about the way in which sort of like, you know, a narrative is structured, you usually you can have like rising tension and you can have falling tension. And so the thing is, when you're talking about the subjective reaction to a story, like, you know, you can't, one of the things that really sort of annoys me about like, you know, a lot of sort of like Japanese media is that like there's always ever escalating odds. It's like this, but like, and this one is more powerful than the previous one, and this one is more, but like it just keeps getting intense, more intense as it goes along, and it's at some point you need to have the release from that. And so what Lauren was pointing out is that like her, I guess you could say, satisfaction in finally getting like that cutscene at the, you know, the end of a difficult fight is, it's not that it's the reward, it's that the release. In other words, it's not interrupting the sort of the gameplay flow, precisely because it actually is following a sort of natural storytelling cycle where you have rising tension,
Yes.
and then you're recognizing the cutscene then acts as the falling tension, so that way you can go back to sort of like rising. And it's this, you know, it's like a sinusoidal wave. Instead of constantly being like at 100%, you know, you go down to 50, back up to 80, maybe back down to 20. And
Yes.
so
Okay.
you have the roller coaster ride of the narrative, which is a what. It's not a how, it's a what, because it sort of understands that like there are going to be certain subjective reactions to various elements in the sequence, and you need to sequence them correctly or in a
Yes.
particular way in order to have particular effects.
Sorry, I'm just like cheering him over here because like this is actually the best. That was a really great way of articulating kind of the problem that I was identifying.
Yeah.
I'm just tripping over my words today. Thank you all for being here. And for me, when you think about great narrative design has those two aspects. It has story and it has gameplay, right?
Yeah.
And what we have to recognize is that story and gameplay match when the gameplay pacing and the storytelling pacing, right, are kind of, I'm not trying to say synonymous, but they're paced adequately enough to where when you have the really tense battle, right?
Yeah.
Narratively, the
Yeah.
story itself is also, right, a tense moment. It
Yeah.
doesn't make sense to have an incredible boss battle, but then like it's not actually the boss?
Yeah.
Question mark, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it would feel really weird if you're like, man, this enemy is super, super tough. Like, I don't understand. Now, Lauren. But there are lots of tough enemies in games where they're all bosses. I mean, I could think of lots of things called souls.
Ugh.
And ugh. Now that's actually that is not a topic we're going to get into today because that is way too deep.
Yep.
And that is going to be more like combat as narrative, right? And also what is storytelling, right? And what is pacing when the narrative itself is the story that you tell yourself is the like blah 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 blah. It's just going to keep going. It's a long sentence. So for now we're going to back up from that, but I'm going to recognize those of you listeners were like, but Lauren, every enemy is a boss in Bloodborne. And I'm like, why yes. At least for me, every enemy is a boss.
That's the thing is, but there are other games that have every enemy as a boss as a trope. In fact, games that preceded the Souls games.
If we talk about Shadow of Colossus, I am gonna. Were you gonna talk about
there's no example.
No. I do this sometimes in the real world, and I apologize. Nicholas, come back to the podcast. What could you ever be referencing? Please let us know.
I may be referencing a game called Shadow of Colossus.
Okay, because he's gonna reference it. No, please actually do reference it because this is quite a. It is actually it's good. I'm so sorry.
Okay, so Shadow of the Colossus is a game in which you fight. It's weird because you both like traverse and fight them at the same time.
Yeah.
It's not quite as simple as like it's just a boss battle. But there is a sequence of, I believe there's 7 of them total in the game. And they're all like these titanic colossi. They're colossal figures. And you as the tiny little hero dude have to essentially like climb up as you fight them. And like that's the entire level. So it's like the entire levels, quote unquote, is this boss battle. But the boss battle has varying structures, varying stages, and like as I said, varying things that you have to do. And in that situation, like, but it still is a very straightforward like narrative structure, because you begin at the bottom of the Colossus and you move up it as you fight, and then when you vanquish it, it collapses to the ground. And so you can literally see in the motion, like up and down the Colossus, like that rising and falling tension, because you climb up the Colossus, the Colossus falls down, you move on to the next one, and it keeps doing that.
And this is what's really exciting, is that I would consider that a lot of narrative, like the pacing, the structure, because the story is so much in the player's hands and the player's experience for how they deliver and how they tell their narrative. Like they're controlling what they see. They're controlling all of it within that player-driven experience, that the story they tell themselves. And even I think when you encounter the certain Colossus, right? Like is it in order, or is it you can actually do them out of order? I don't remember.
I haven't played that game in forever. I believe it's in order.
I think it maybe, even if it is in order, you can't really storyboard, right, a player's experience like you can in Shadow of the Colossus, like you could storyboard, right, the opening of Halo. And I think that's the key difference, right, is that what you see and hear is in the designer's hands in Halo, and what you see and feel, right, and hear and like understand and experience is in your hands, right? That story that you're telling is in your hands as the player in Shadow of the Colossus. And so the narrative, right, that all comes together is the narrative really has to be strong. The world building, the pacing of the level itself becomes the game. But in both instances, the narrative is still good, right? The story still exists. It's just two different ways of what that story actually is, whether it is a single player, heavily scripted, bespoke moment, or whether it is completely in the player's hands and is a more open-ended and user-driven experience.
And I think actually that's probably a really great place to stop for this week, because we have sort of arrived at the arrival point. we are at the way station now. And so
we are now at the way station.
I want to thank you all for listening, and remind you that if you want to hear more on this particular topic, because we'll be doing an even deeper dive into this massive ocean of narrative and storytelling, you can subscribe to our Patreon. That's patreon.com/furidashi. It's $5 a month to get the bonus episodes. We also have a $15 a month tier where you get access to our Discord and even more content, and you can communicate directly with Lauren and myself. If you want to, take pot shots at us on Twitter, we have the podcast Twitter, which is Furidashi Pod. Lauren is the Lauren Ash. I am Academicality. And that is all for this week, and we hope to hear from you or see you again next time.